Ancient Civilizations lecture notes. We are going to be talking about Rome today. So we're going to scroll all the way down to slide number 60. These notes go through all of the civilizations, well, most, not all, of course, but some of the civilizations at least that you'll study or that you have studied in middle school. We're going to review ancient Rome. Hopefully you talked about a little bit in 8th grade. So you're going to scroll all the way down to slide number 60. Where we start on Rome. Sometimes I categorize or put them together with ancient Greece, but we're going to just talk about ancient Rome today. So a quick little overview here. Ancient Rome is a massive unit in world history. Again, it should be slightly a review from your middle school days in ancient Civ. Historians today break the idea of ancient Rome, and really I'm just going to refer to ancient Rome as Rome now, into three different time periods. The first we call the Roman Kingdom, then we have the Roman Republic, then the most notable, the Roman Empire. And there's the dates there. A key date to note is 753 BC or BCE. That's the date that Rome was founded. And then another important date, obviously, is the fall of Rome, 476, which is where we will focus our studies on in freshman world history. Now, the important part here, just an overview again, Rome becomes one of the largest empires in the world. Over 50 million people that were considered inhabitants or citizens, really, most of them citizens. Some slaves, some servants, but citizens or inhabitants of the Roman Empire at its height. Now we see this timeline here again, Kingdom, Republic, Empire. While we categorize them as three time periods, they are to scale, on the timeline below, the Kingdom being the shortest, a little bit longer of the Republic, and then the Empire is the vast majority of the Roman time period. We do see a split between the Western Empire and Eastern Empire. We'll get into that a little bit more later. Now, the quick founding of Rome, I'm going to move through these notes very quickly. Hopefully, again, they're mostly a review. There's kind of a mythical story behind the founding of Rome. Brothers Romulus and Remus are descendants of a Trojan prince, and they basically find the location of the city at the end of a river, and they start to quarrel, and they fight, actually. And Romulus kills Remus, becomes the ruler of this new city, being Rome. All right, and again, 753, just to review, this is 753 years before the Common Era, prior considered before Christ. So we're 700 years before the birth of Jesus. Now, prior to Rome, a brief review, we have the Etruscan civilization. Now, these are the people that basically existed around the area in which Rome was founded. And the Etruscans, a lot of the Roman culture we have is from the Etruscans. And around the 8th century BC, 8th, 9th, 10th centuries BC, and they basically use the very fertile soil to farm, and they use the iron ore and the copper to create pottery to use in trade. We see artwork. We see this culture emerge prior to the Roman Empire. And the Romans were this kind of eventually who becomes the Romans were this kind of woodsman-y people who were kind of hunter-gatherers who didn't really get along with the Etruscans. But the Etruscans were very technologically advanced. They had great architecture. They had trading squares. They used water for sewage and for draining, and again for agriculture. Eventually, those Romans, who were kind of this tough backwoodsman peoples, eventually fight with the Etruscans and kind of take over the region and start to control the region. And they, again, this is 800 years before the birth of Christ. So lots of quarreling, lots of warfare over land and over wealth. All right, so moving on. So again, that's pre-Rome, the Etruscan people that a lot of the Roman culture comes from. Now the Roman kingdom is a kingdom. It's marked by kings. We do see the establishment of a senate or a group of men to kind of counsel the government. But we also see a very unique political culture form within Rome, where members of the Senate, again, wealthy landowners, are able to kind of debate politics. Now, the religion this time is a polytheistic faith. In English class, you'll study a little bit of Greek and Roman mythology, and while they are very similar, there are different Greek and Roman gods. Aphrodite and Ares, and some of them are super important in Greek mythology. Some of them are super important in Roman mythology. And the point of the religion aspect is that it was a polytheistic religion. They had a god of war, and they had a sun god, and they had different gods to represent different ways of worship. Right? Not to be confused with monotheism, which we'll talk about very soon, a single god faith. But the religion is a polytheistic religion. All right, so we start to see the development of religion. We start to see the development of politics, corrupt politics in that, but politics nonetheless. All right, now you do not have to know all of these individuals, but I put them in the notes just to kind of see what some Roman names look like and some of the more prominent historical figures in the Roman kingdom. We call this period the Seven Kings, beginning, of course, with Romulus, the founder of Rome in 753. And then we see some of the other ones that basically rule for about 200 years. Now, again, the people are less important than what they kind of establish and what they ultimately do for Rome. We see local trade, we see populations growing, we start to see religions growing, we start to see warfare, we see the first construction of aqueducts, which bring water to Rome. We see the Circus Maximus, which is this grand structure in Rome. We see the conduction of the first census, which is a way of calculating how many people live in Rome. So we do see some developments, political developments, economic developments, religious developments, but there are some corruptions. We see some fratricide, and we see some warfare and hostility between kings and sons, and kings and people, and the king and the Senate as well. So it's kind of very hostile and very chaotic at times. Yes, did Rome, get their roots into the ground? Yes, but we'll see some improvements, some slow improvements at this time. Then we have the Roman Republic. Now, this is a step in a more democratic government. Democracy is founded by the Greeks, and the Romans start to use it a little bit. And the Republic basically takes power away from the king and gives it to people, specifically, wealthy government officials, but nonetheless people. We see the election of magistrates, which are basically like, mayors or senators or congressmen. We see assemblies forming. We see a military command by not just one person, but by consuls and by generals. We start to see the peninsula of Italy being taken over. Remember, Rome is at the center of Italy. When we think of Italy, we automatically think of Rome, which you should. Then we see wars, and we see warfare throughout the second, all the way through. The 4th century, we start to see Rome is attacked by the Gauls, which are this Celtic tribe out in Western Europe, kind of the area of France. We start to see them invade Rome. Then we see the Punic Wars, and the Punic Wars are very interesting. There's 3 of them. They fight with Carthage, which is in North Africa. And if we think about where Rome is located, it is on the Mediterranean. And, whoever controlled the Mediterranean controlled trade and, obviously warfare. And this was over control of that. the Romans are able to defeat Carthage and destroy Carthage as a city. But the Phoenicians were very well known for their shipbuilding, their shipbuilding and their warfare on the seas. So we see the Gaul fighting with the Gauls. We see them fighting with Carthage. Then we see other Roman wars in the 2nd century. They defeat Macedon, which is the most famous Macedonian ruler. I'm sure you've heard of him, was Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great is 3rd century BC as well. And he goes on to control one of the largest, rivaled basically with Rome in terms of size of the empire. But Alexander the Great is a major figure in ancient world history, and hopefully you've talked about him a little bit, but he controls the regions of Mesopotamia and all of Macedon, eventually conquers parts of Egypt and Babylon. He's an incredible figure in world history. But they're going to fight, the Romans are going to fight with those groups as well, all over the Mediterranean. So we start to see the establishment of a military, a more representative government, and because of that, we start to see warfare throughout. Now, a little bit more about politics. The 1st century BC, kind of going in a timeline here between 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and the 1st. This is the era which most students know the most about, or some students know the most about. And the Roman Republic were basically divided between 2 groups, kind of similar to how we have Democrats and Republicans today on the political spectrum. And, we're not going to get into it too much, but the idea is that different groups of people had different thoughts about how government should be ruled. Now, what emerges in these early 1st century BC Roman politics is the idea of what's called the First Triumvirate. And the First Triumvirate is the most famous being Julius Caesar, along with Crassus and Pompey, who form this group of 3 who rule over Rome. Now, Crassus eventually dies, and Pompey and Caesar kind of try to gain power over each other. And what Caesar does is he conquers Gaul. And that's a huge deal because the Celtic tribes there that were kind of invading the Roman Empire, kind of like a thorn in the Romans' side. Julius Caesar is able to, put those groups of people down by defeating and kind of taking over that area. And because of that, Caesar is appointed as the dictator of Rome in 48 BC, another turning point in Roman history. And at that point, we start to see the birth of the Roman Republic. Now, Julius Caesar, and again, you will read hopefully a little bit more about Caesar, or have read a little bit more about Caesar in middle school. Caesar is probably the most famous Romans, one of the most famous Romans, and he's most notable for becoming the dictator of Rome, and as well as his death. And he does have some great accomplishments. We have the Julian calendar, which we see the months of July and August added. A lot of citizens are going to gain their citizenship. A lot of those inhabitants all over Rome are going to become citizens of Rome. And he's going to come up with these governmental reforms, which kind of anger some of the wealthy elites of the time. Now, side note, a little bit interesting, Julius Caesar actually has a relationship with Cleopatra. Now, we oftentimes don't think about Egypt and Rome, but Cleopatra and Julius Caesar lived together, and not only did they live at the same time, rather, they were supposedly in love. Now, what happens, and I think I have a little bit more about this, yes, in just a second here. Cleopatra also has a love interest with one of Julius Caesar's generals, Mark Antony. What we'll talk about in a second. It's kind of a love triangle here. Now, more about Julius Caesar. He eventually, because of his conquering and because of him becoming almost too powerful, he ends up being assassinated on March 15th, what we call the Ides of March. And the members of the Senate who opposed Caesar's rule and his kind of dictatorship, they thought he had too much power. They turn on Caesar and end up stabbing him multiple times to kill him. And Brutus kind of leads the charge, and he said, the most famous phrase is "et tu, Brute," which means like, "and you, Brutus, you were the one that, you were part of this plan to kill me." And some people, historians today, will argue that Caesar was a tyrant who, deserved to kind of die in a sense. But others thought that the Republic had been failing, and Caesar stepping in to become dictator was something that saved the Republic. So there's two sides of Julius Caesar. A little bit more about Caesar and Mark Antony and Cleopatra and what happens after. Mark Antony, one of Caesar's generals, ends up falling in love with Cleopatra. And Caesar obviously is killed, and there's some other love interests as well. But what happens after Caesar dies is Octavian takes over. And he has a lot of rule in the West. Mark Antony has an army in the East, kind of centered around Egypt, obviously, and they go to war over this. And in 31 BCE, the Battle of Actium is fought, and it basically is kind of control of Rome. And Octavian in the West is able to defeat Mark Antony and Cleopatra. And because of that, Mark Antony and Cleopatra, who are now in love, they end up both taking their lives in 30 BC. And, Cleopatra, one of the most famous Egyptian rulers, tries to put Egypt back on the map and does so in a lot of ways. But eventually Egypt kind of becomes almost what we call a province, but kind of like a colony of the Roman Empire. And it's a huge deal at this point because Egypt had been ruled by pharaohs for thousands and thousands of years, prior, basically all the way back to when they built the pyramids. So that's a big deal. And the point of this is that Rome becomes very powerful under Caesar and under Octavian. Now, Octavian eventually becomes the sole ruler of Rome, and he ends up taking the name Augustus when he becomes the ruler of Rome. And Augustus, also actually known as Augustus Caesar, takes over power, and he is a relative of Caesar's. I believe he is the nephew of Caesar. On his mother's side, I want to say. Don't quote me on that. So he basically does what Caesar does. He's kind of a disciple of Caesar in a lot of ways when he's younger, and he takes the Senate's power. But what happens is, which Caesar kind of hoped to do when he was ruler, we have this era, what's called the Pax Romana, or Roman peace, about a 200-year period where peace and prosperity reign over the Roman Empire. And a lot of that corruption that was in the Roman Republic is kind of ended by Augustus. And during this time, Rome goes through some wonderful triumphs. They basically increase their size. About middle of the 2nd century, Rome becomes massive, controls basically all the Mediterranean, parts of North Africa, the Holy Land, or places like Jerusalem, into the Middle East, obviously all of Southern Europe here, all of the Italian peninsula. And they start to implement these sets of laws, these uniform sets of laws. They establish judges and trials and legal contracts. And we see the development of the Latin alphabet, which is derived from the Phoenicians and the Greeks. Latin is the language of the Roman Empire. We start to see trade increase. Warfare is going to decrease. The Roman army becomes the most feared in all of the land. So overall, this is a period of peace and prosperity in the 1st and 2nd century 1st and 2nd century AD. Now, this is Rome in 117. Now, we sometimes use AD or CE, the Common Era, but this is just an immense amount of territory. This would be dozens and dozens of modern-day countries. Again, all of Southern Europe, obviously at the Italian Peninsula, parts of North Africa. Carthage, I mentioned Carthage. This is the city of Carthage here. Into places like Jerusalem, This is all of modern-day Turkey, all of modern-day Greece, and southeastern Europe as well. So an immense territory. A little bit more about Roman architecture. We see very similar styles of Greek architecture, the use of brick and Roman concrete. Roman concrete, if you have time to go on YouTube and read a little bit more about Roman concrete, it is incredible. There are some roads that still exist. There's a Roman road that are 2,000 years old, that are sometimes in better shape than highways that are built today. And there's a reason for that based on the use of Roman concrete. It's really cool. But we see the uses of arches and columns, different styles of columns and domes and walls and aqueducts and roads and bridges. It's an incredible, one of the most important aspects of Roman culture was their architecture. The use of the Colosseum, the Circus Maximus, built during the Roman kingdom. We see the use of gladiator battles. If you've ever seen the movie Gladiator, the Pantheon, which worships the gods. But Roman architecture is one of the most incredible aspects of Roman culture. Again, some pictures here, that Roman road, some aqueducts, the Pantheon, the Colosseum. Really, really, really incredible. This is a map of Rome, what Rome looked like with the defensive walls. This is Hadrian's Wall, which is in England. So all of these buildings and roads still exist today, which shows how incredible the Romans were at making these structures. All right, so then we have Constantine. In my eyes, maybe the most important, at least for our class's purposes, the most important Roman. Now, Constantine did something. He's known for kind of converting, or at least allowing Christianity to exist. Now, I have a separate lecture on world religions. We'll talk about Christianity a little bit. It's one of the major topics in world history, as is all religions. But what happens is, in the 4th century, Rome begins to struggle. The Pax Romana was such a nice time in Roman history that all good things come to an end, and the economy starts to fail. We start to see more warfare. We start to see disease and plague and starvation. And what happens in the 3rd century is Rome is actually divided. I mentioned this on the timeline at the very beginning of the overview. Rome is divided between Western Rome and Eastern Rome. And Eastern Rome actually goes to continue on, but one of the major reasons why Rome fails is because it's almost too immense, right? It's too huge. It's too difficult to govern. There wasn't enough local politics, and that combined with the struggling economy and the invasions, and we'll talk about these things in a second, they start to kind of decline. But Constantine, he takes control in 306. He makes Christianity legal in the empire. This is now 300 years after Christ, and the Romans were the ones that condemned Jesus in the 1st century, very early 1st century. Pontius Pilate was a Roman magistrate, basically a Roman governor in Jerusalem and in Judea, and the Romans put Jesus to death, and they basically said, well, it was the Jews, it was the rulers of the Jewish faith in that region that really did that. But nonetheless, Jesus was condemned, and eventually Christianity slowly starts to spread. But it's at this point, the legalization of Christianity empire, Constantine is said to have this vision of a burning cross on his deathbed. It's kind of this crazy story. But he establishes Christianity as the dominant religion in Rome, and that is what allows Christianity to spread. And most people living in Europe today are Christian, and they have Constantine to thank for that. He also ends the gladiator battles in the Colosseum, and we also see the establishment of the city Constantinople, which is in today in modern-day Turkey. Istanbul is the current name of the old Constantinople, which we'll talk about. And Constantinople becomes the capital in the east. Rome remains the capital in the west. We see kind of differences in the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. But the important thing is that Constantine makes Christianity legal in the empire in 312. So this is that split that Diocletian, I mentioned his name prior, He is here 285 AD. Diocletian, he's the one that splits the empire, kind of recognizing the struggle that Rome is having, becoming too large to govern. So we have the Western Roman Empire here in this orange color, and then the Eastern Roman Empire in this pinkish purple color. Constantinople becomes the capital of the Eastern Empire. Rome remains the capital of the Western Empire. Now, if you know anything about Roman history, eventually this purple-pink territory becomes the Eastern Roman Empire, also called the Byzantine Empire, which we'll talk about in class a little bit later. All right, now the focus here, the end, the collapse of Rome. Now, I mentioned these before. I alluded to them in the last slide. The collapse of Rome is a slow motion process. It takes place over centuries. Really, it starts to ramp up after the death of Constantine. But the invasions had begun, as early as the 4th century BC. And they continued into the 1st century CE, the 2nd, the 3rd, all the way up until the 4th. Now, the date we use for the fall of Rome is 476, which I mentioned prior. Now, all of these reasons, failing economy, poor leadership, invasions of these tribes, what happens is these nomadic tribes from Europe basically start to invade the empire. They're considered these barbarians, if you've ever heard that word before, advanced and skilled in warfare. They basically go into Roman cities, steal, loot, sack these Roman cities, and then head back to their home. And that happens for centuries. We also see plague, as I mentioned. Agriculture starts to decline. There's a big tax burden on the middle class. The leaders, the Roman emperors who ruled Rome were not very good at their jobs, along with these barbarian invasions. Some people just try to blame Christianity for the fall of Rome. There's lots of these theories as to why Rome falls, but really it's this combination of reasons that ultimately lead to the fall of Rome in 476. We use 476. The Vandals are these groups, the Huns, the Goths. They sack Rome, the city of Rome, in 476, and that's what historians use as the date. This could say AD or CE. Now, Eastern Rome, as I mentioned, the Byzantine Empire is going to continue to thrive for basically another 1,000 years. But we'll have a separate lecture on the Byzantine Empire. This is a map here describing some of those barbarian invasions, or these invasions of local tribes and local peoples. You'll see some of these names. We'll go over some of these in more detail, but the Anglos and the Saxons, the Franks, the Goths, the Visigoths, the Huns, the Vandals, they go into all this Roman territory. All of this is Western Rome, Eastern Rome as well. Remember that map I just showed you prior. They go into these territories, they go into these Roman cities, and they steal and loot and kill, eventually sacking Rome. The Vandals are the ones that kind of lead to the ultimate, or the straw that breaks the camel's back, is the Vandal invasion of Rome. And the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths as well. So that is the end of the Roman Empire. It is a long, dense history. I only spend a few minutes here talking about it. We could basically talk about Rome for the entire school year. That's how in-depth it is, interesting, and a lot of our local or our recent history in the United States history, a lot of our culture comes from Rome, and architecture and politics, religion, and other aspects of culture. But we will end our lecture there. Again, this was on Rome and eventually the fall of Rome.